My name is Emma, and 10 years of carrying my entire family ended in a single sentence. At our so-called inheritance celebration, my father slid every asset our care facilities, the company, even the house across the table to my sister Lisa, who had only been back for 1 week after nearly a decade of disappearing. My mother nodded proudly, saying, "She deserves it," as if I hadn't rebuilt everything they nearly lost. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply placed the power of attorney, the same one that saved their lives more times than they knew, and the house keys on the table, then handed Lisa a letter that would make her face drain white. If you've ever been the child who gave everything only to be pushed aside, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I wasn't born the quiet child I was shaped into her. Long before tonight's inheritance dinner, long before I learned how signatures and state regulations could protect a life's work, there was simply the Hart family in Savannah, Georgia. My parents owned a modest but respected chain of senior care homes called Hart Senior Living, a name locals trusted for its warmth, its stability, and the way the nurses always seemed to know every resident's birthday by heart. Growing up, those facilities felt more like home to me than the actual house we lived in. I remember trailing behind my dad as he walked the halls, stopping to greet every resident like they were old friends. I was the child who stayed quiet in the corner, listening to their stories, memorizing their medicine schedules for fun, pushing wheelchairs even when I was barely tall enough to see over the handles. I loved the smell of disinfectant and lavender lotion, the way the older ladies would squeeze my hands and say, "You'll do great things, sweetheart." Maybe they saw something my parents refused to see. My sister, Lisa, was the opposite of me in every way. Where I hovered near the nurse's station, she glided down the hallways in frilly dresses, doing twirls for the residents and posing for photos my mother eagerly uploaded to Facebook. Our little star. She'd caption, "Future leader of Hart Senior Living." She was radiant in a way children often are: big eyes, perfect curls, a laugh that made strangers smile. People adored her instantly. My parents adored her loudly. They adored me, quietly. Emma's independent. They'd tell relatives with a shrug, "She's the kind of kid who raises herself." They meant it like praise. It felt like dismissal. They said, "Lisa is special. Lisa needs opportunities. We can't waste her potential." For every ballet class, acting camp, leadership retreat, and summer enrichment program Lisa's name appeared on. Mine never did. It wasn't that I begged for those things I didn't. I learned early that wanting made me inconvenient. But even so, when you watch your little sister get $1,000 summer camp while you pick up extra chores to help cover bills, something inside you splinters. The message became clear. Lisa deserved investment. I deserved responsibility. By the time I was 12, I was doing small tasks at the care homes, folding towels, labeling medication drawers, helping residents write messages to their families. By 16, I had convinced the night manager to let me take weekend overnight shifts. I told my parents I needed the job because I wanted experience. The truth: they needed help paying the mortgage after one of their buildings failed an inspection. And no one asked if I could contribute, they simply assumed I would. Still, my mother told people I lacked ambition. The irony never left me. That was our household dynamic. Lisa, the glittering promise. Emma, the reliable scaffolding no one bothered to paint. When Lisa got a B+ in a science class, Mom hired a private tutor. When I brought home straight A's, Dad nodded and said, "Good. That's expected from you." On Lisa's birthdays, she got new dresses, themed cakes, and rooms full of relatives singing her praises. On mine, I got hugs and a reminder to pack my work uniform if I had a shift afterward. I didn't resent her, not then. How could I? Children can't be blamed for being adored. But I understood the hierarchy early. My parents loved us both. But they valued Lisa. They trusted me. But they believed in her. And that difference shaped everything. Sometimes I wonder if things would have changed had Lisa shown even a sliver of interest in the family business. But she never did. She preferred crowds, cameras, compliments, things the halls of a senior care home didn't give her. While I learned about medication logs and wound care and regulatory compliance, She learned how to pose at an angle that made her jawline sharper. My mom once joked, "Emma is the heart of Hart Senior Living, but Lisa is the face." I laughed politely, but inside I understood the truth. I was the engine. Lisa was the billboard. The favoritism wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was soft, subtle, woven into everyday life. Like when my parents insisted Lisa needed a better laptop for school, while I typed my scholarship essays on a second-hand computer missing the S key. Or when they sent her to a photography course in Atlanta because networking is important. While I drove Grandma to chemo appointments and filled out insurance forms no one else understood. Or when Lisa wanted a new bedroom set and got it immediately, while I stayed in the same blue-painted room Dad decorated when I was 8, even though I was 17, and working nights to help the family business stay afloat. Those little moments add up. They accumulate like dust in the corners of a house no one bothers to deep clean. They teach you to keep your head down, to be grateful for scraps, to accept being the one who holds everything together while someone else receives the spotlight. Looking back, I can see the pattern with painful clarity. I was trained to carry, and Lisa was trained to shine. My parents didn't do it out of malice. They did it out of laziness. It is easier to lean on the child who never complains. Easier to pour resources into the child who mirrors the fantasy life you built in your head. Easier to assume the strong one doesn't need support. By the time I entered adulthood, my identity felt predetermined. I was the caretaker, the problem solver, the steady hand behind the scenes. And Lisa, she was the face of the family, the one introduced proudly to friends, the one spoken of with future tense admiration, even when she offered nothing but charm, especially when she offered nothing but charm. I didn't know then how deeply this imbalance would matter. I didn't know that one day, the same parents who leaned on me for everything from medical decisions to financial crises would be the ones to hand the entire family legacy to the daughter who abandoned them for nearly a decade. 10 years ago, everything shifted at once, as if my family's entire world cracked open in a single season. I was 24, finally starting to build a quiet, steady life of my own, working at a behavioral health center in Savannah, saving for a small apartment, believing I could exist as something other than the reliable daughter. But life doesn't ask whether you're ready. It simply arrives with its emergencies. It started with my father. One humid July afternoon, I got a call from one of the nurses at Hart Senior, leaving her voice trembling just enough to tell me something was wrong before she even spoke the words. Dad had collapsed during an audit meeting. A mild heart attack. They said, small, but not insignificant. His blood pressure was unstable. His diabetes was poorly controlled. The cardiologist recommended reducing all work-related stress immediately. He shouldn't be making major decisions for a while. The doctor told us gently. I remember looking at my father, once the man who carried everything, now exhausted, pale, and unable to finish a sentence without catching his breath and realizing the shift had already begun. 2 months later, before we had even adjusted to Dad's diagnosis, my mother found a lump in her breast. The biopsy was quick. The results were brutal. She needed surgery, then radiation, then months of follow-up treatments. I still remember the way she stared at the oncologist's pamphlet, blinking slowly, as if the words refused to settle into meaning. Our family, so used to pretending everything was fine, suddenly had no energy left to pretend. And while illness was tearing my parents down physically, the business was collapsing alongside them. Hart Senior Living had always been small, but trusted until a wave of staffing shortages hit us. New state regulations tightened. Medicaid froze payments pending documentation updates my father had been too overwhelmed to complete. One facility was at risk of failing an inspection, and if it failed, the entire chain could be flagged. Employees quit faster than we could hire. It felt like being caught in a storm with holes in every window. And where was Lisa? Los Angeles. She had left for her influencer dreams 3 years earlier, with suitcases full of pastel outfits, and a ring light Dad bought her to support her passion. She called occasionally, usually when she needed money for investing in her brand, meaning photo shoots, acting workshops, luxury gym memberships. She'd tell Mom things like, "If I grow my platform, it'll help the family business one day." Mom repeated those words like gospel. But the truth, she didn't come home. Not for Dad's heart attack. Not for Mom's surgery. Not even when Medicaid threatened to cut our funding. Something that could have folded the business overnight. She posted palm trees, sunsets, and rooftop brunches on Instagram while I slept on a vinyl couch in a hospital waiting room. The doctors, the social worker, the lawyer, they all said the same thing. Someone needed to hold medical and financial power of attorney. Someone had to be legally authorized to make decisions for both parents and for the business if things worsened. If not, the state would appoint someone, and the state doesn't care about your family legacy. My father, breathing through an oxygen tube, looked at me with a mixture of guilt and resignation. My mother, weak from chemo, squeezed my hand. "It should be Emma," she whispered, not because she thought I deserved it, but because she knew I wouldn't drop the responsibility. Lisa's name was never even mentioned. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for thanks. I simply signed. And they signed, and the nurse notarized the documents. In that moment, the entire weight of our family shifted onto my shoulders in a way that was both familiar and suffocating. I became the legal decision-maker for everything medical care, finances, contracts, liabilities, everything my parents were supposed to handle, everything Lisa claimed she would help with someday, became mine. So I quit my job, not because I wanted to God. I loved that job, but because Heart Senior Living was bleeding out. I moved back into my childhood room, the same blue walls, the same creaky dresser, the same reminder of who my parents believed I would always be. And then I went to work. I cleaned up the documentation for Medicaid, pulling all-nighters to update compliance logs. I met with the bank to renegotiate loan terms, sitting across from men twice my age who didn't bother hiding their skepticism. I walked through each facility with clipboards and gloves, checking supplies, reorganizing medication rooms, rewriting training protocols, catching safety violations before inspectors could. I worked shifts when staff called out. I rotated through weekends. I slept in my car between hospital visits and board meetings. For months, I lived in a loop. Hospital, facility, home, hospital. I forgot what sunlight before 10 a.m. looked like. My clothes smelled like antiseptic. My inbox became a battlefield. And yet, even as I held everything together, my mother still found a way to say it. "Emma, you need more ambition. You can't just bury yourself in work forever." If only she knew that burying myself in work was the only reason the business survived. The only reason Medicaid unfroze. The only reason the state didn't shut us down. The only reason she could lie in her recovery bed without worrying about losing everything. Meanwhile, Lisa texted, "Hey, Em, could you send me $600 for a workshop? It's important for my growth." She never asked how Dad was recovering. She didn't even ask how the business was doing. Looking back now, it's almost laughable how everyone assumed I would handle it. How no one paused to wonder what it cost me. How natural it felt to them that the independent one would sacrifice her life for the family, yet again. But this was the decade that hardened me. The decade that taught me how systems worked: legal, financial, operational. The decade that taught me that doing everything silently only makes people more comfortable taking advantage of you. And it was during this same decade that a seed began to grow inside me. A quiet warning planted by an old physician who had watched families tear each other apart over inheritances and control. He said one sentence I never forgot. "Emma, you can save your parents, but don't ever forget to protect what you build while saving them." I didn't understand then, but I would. And everything that happened tonight, every shocked face, every raised voice, every accusation, they all began in this moment, 10 years ago. When I picked up responsibilities no one else wanted and became the backbone of a family that never once wondered what would happen if the backbone decided to stand up straight. Saving the company didn't happen in one heroic moment. It happened in thousands of small, unglamorous decisions, most of them made at 2 a.m. When the hallways of Heart Senior Living were quiet, except for the hum of oxygen machines and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes. Once the crisis stabilized just enough for me to breathe, I realized something. Patching holes wasn't enough. If we wanted to survive, the entire system needed rebuilding from the inside out. So I started with what I knew best: care. The kind of care that didn't come from spreadsheets or state regulations, but from sitting beside people who'd lived long enough to forget their own birthdays. I designed a new mental and emotional wellness program for our residents, not because it was trendy, but because the loneliness in those halls was louder than any medical chart. I created group storytelling sessions, memory-building exercises, volunteer visits from local schools, and small life circles where residents could talk about grief, aging, humor, or whatever helped them feel human. The program looked simple on paper. It changed everything in practice. Next, I rewrote every operational protocol myself: medication logs, safety rounds, transfer procedures, nutrition plans, end-of-life guidelines, anything that had been patched together over 20 years. I rebuilt. I retrained the entire staff, not by lecturing them, but by working alongside them. I made it clear we weren't cutting corners on care. We were cutting waste. No more overpriced vendors, no more useless subscriptions, no more supplies that expired before anyone opened the box. Every dollar needed to matter. Financially, I had to become something I never wanted to be: ruthless. I sat through meetings with insurance reps who tried to talk over me, assuming I didn't understand reimbursement structures. I learned to smile politely and slide corrected calculations across the table until their smirks evaporated. I renegotiated every contract we had, from insurance partnerships to therapy providers, and enrolled our facilities in federal programs that rewarded quality improvements. It was tedious, strategic work, but it kept us alive. Some months, I took home barely enough to cover gas and food. I told my mother I was fine with it. She said nothing, not realizing the irony. But the part that always sticks with me is how the dynamic at home shifted just slightly, like a picture frame tilting on the wall. My father began looking at me differently, not with warmth, but with recognition. He'd walk into a facility and notice the order, the calmer residents, the improved inspections. He'd nod slowly, the way people do when they finally understand the value of something they'd taken for granted. Yet in front of relatives, he still praised Lisa. "Our youngest has such a spark." He'd say, "She's got real leadership energy." Meanwhile, she was uploading selfies from Los Angeles rooftops, captioned with inspirational quotes she didn't believe in. My mother was harder to read. Part gratitude, part resentment. On good days, she'd thank me for handling her insurance papers or driving her to appointments. On bad days, she'd accuse me of taking over, of making her feel incompetent. Once, after a long chemo session, she snapped, "If you weren't always fixing everything, maybe I wouldn't feel so useless." I understood the pain beneath her words, but it still stung. Being the reliable one meant absorbing everyone's emotions, even the ones they didn't know how to manage. During those years, I studied quietly. At night, after the last resident settled into bed, I'd open my laptop and take online courses on healthcare management, nonprofit administration, regulatory compliance, data systems for long-term care, anything that could make me sharper. A few older physicians and small-time investors who admired how I cared for their loved ones began offering mentorship. Men and women in their 60s and 70s who'd lived long enough to recognize competence when they saw it. They taught me things no textbook covered. One of them, a retired healthcare attorney named Dr. Alden, was the first person to say something that changed the trajectory of my entire life. He'd come to visit his wife, who was in our memory care unit, and often lingered to chat while I did nighttime charting. One evening, after listening to me explain how I was reorganizing the company, he tapped his pen on the table and said, "You're building something bigger than they realize." I shrugged, too tired to understand. "I'm just trying to keep us from shutting down." "No," he said firmly. "You're creating the intellectual backbone of this entire system. The policies, the standards, the relationships, the data, the culture. That's you, not the buildings, not the name. You. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice as if the walls were listening. Emma, sweetheart, you must learn to separate what belongs to the company, what belongs to the residents, and what belongs to you. Because one day, someone will hand all your work to another person simply because they share your last name. The words settled like a stone in my chest. I didn't know then what he meant. But I would, over the next few years, everything I built strengthened the company, yet it also clarified something else. The structure was fragile, as long as it lived under my parents' assumptions and Lisa's shadow. The more success we rebuilt, the more loudly they talked about giving Lisa the future, as if future meant branding photos and inspirational slogans, not emergency codes and compliance laws. Still, I worked quietly, tirelessly. I built Hart Senior Living into a system that could have thrived for decades if led by someone who cared more about people than perception. And without realizing it, I was also building the foundation of something else entirely, something that would one day determine who truly owned the legacy my parents tried to give away. The seed Dr. Alden planted would grow roots I didn't expect, and those roots would eventually tear the ground open at the inheritance dinner. The night my sister opened that letter and screamed, "You're joking." But before any of that happened, I had to learn the final lesson. Sometimes the strongest thing the quiet child can do is build something others can't take from her, even when they think they already have. For nearly a decade, while Hart Senior Living clawed its way back from the edge and I poured every piece of myself into holding it upright, Lisa lived an entirely different life, one carefully staged in golden sunlight and filtered skies. Her world was brunches with aspiring models, rooftop pools overlooking Los Angeles, audition lines wrapped around studio lots, and photo shoots where every pose looked like she was waiting to be discovered. Whenever I opened social media during a rare quiet moment, there she was smiling at Malibu beaches, toasting mimosas, tagging brands I'd never heard of. To anyone watching, she looked free, radiant, limitless. To me, she looked like someone who had never once scrubbed a dining room table in a dementia wing at 2 a.m. She called home occasionally, though never about Dad's heart medications or Mom's recovery scans or the facility that had nearly failed an inspection. Instead, she'd call Mom for money, just a little boost for acting workshops, studio makeup, headshots, reels, and Mom sent it. Even when we were behind on payroll or negotiating loan extensions, she's sensitive, Mom would whisper defensively. We can't pressure her. She's out there chasing big dreams. Every time Mom said that, I felt a small, irrational anger twist inside me, not at Lisa for dreaming, but at the way my parents treated dreams like fragile glass that only one daughter was allowed to hold. Still, life continued. I worked, Lisa posted, and the distance between our worlds grew so large it didn't feel like we were sisters anymore. Just two people raised in the same house with entirely different expectations placed upon them. Then, 9 years after she left, one random Tuesday morning, my phone rang. I remember exactly where I was, in Facility 2's supply closet, reorganizing wound care materials because our vendor had sent the wrong size gauze again. I almost missed the call. When I answered, Lisa's voice came through, shaky in a way that felt performative, but also real enough to pause my breathing. "Ain," she said softly. "I think I'm done with LA," just like that, like she was announcing a new haircut. She told me she had given everything to her influencer actor journey. Things didn't work out. The industry was fake. People were toxic. Her agency had dropped her. She was exhausted, drained, misunderstood. Then came the line she had rehearsed somewhere between her apartment and the airport. "I want to come home and help the family business. I've learned so much about branding, social media strategy, digital marketing. I can finally contribute." It was the longest she'd spoken to me in years. I didn't believe a word of it, not the part about wanting to help, nor the part about having acquired meaningful skills. But I said what I always say. "Okay, come home safe." I hung up and returned to my supplies. When Lisa finally arrived at the house 2 days later, pulling a pale pink suitcase into the foyer, you would have thought an actual celebrity had walked in. My parents lit up. My father forgot his aches, his blood pressure monitor, his stubborn limp. My mother, who'd barely had the energy to finish her physical therapy exercises, suddenly had the stamina to host people. They called relatives, old friends, former church members. They made a welcome home dinner with her favorite foods. They held up wine glasses and toasted her return. And then, little by little, they began rewriting history. Suddenly, Lisa wasn't the daughter who disappeared for 9 years. She was the daughter who went to Los Angeles to study brand strategy. She wasn't the one who begged for money. She was the one who invested in her professional development. She wasn't avoiding the family crisis. She was gaining the tools Hart Senior Living needs for the next chapter. It was almost impressive how effortlessly they rebranded her entire absence. I watched it happen the way someone watches a house being redecorated around them while they're still standing inside it. Within a week, my father brought Lisa to the facilities, giving her a tour as if she'd built a single brick of it. To the staff, he introduced her as the future of Hart Senior Living. I stood behind them with the tablet containing months of compliance work that had kept us afloat. Feeling suddenly invisible, Lisa will oversee branding and community outreach, Dad announced proudly. Maybe even step into a leadership role soon. Leadership. That word tasted metallic in my mouth. She took photos in front of the facility entrance, hands clasped gently with a resident in a wheelchair. My resident. The one I sat with during her panic attacks. Lisa posted the picture online with a caption about rediscovering purpose. It got thousands of likes. She filmed short TikToks highlighting the beauty of elder care, adding soft music and captions like "Honor where you come from." People swooned. They praised her heart. They praised her devotion to family. Meanwhile, I was the person who'd rewritten the care protocols she was standing in front of. To be fair, she wasn't malicious. She was simply surface level. Everything to her existed at the height of a camera lens. Inside the company, she floated through departments, smiling, offering creative ideas, sketching logo redesigns in pastel colors. She suggested uniforms with softer palettes, new fonts for our website, inspirational murals for the hallways. Nothing harmful, nothing helpful either. But to my parents, it was genius. I became the operations helper. Lisa became the visionary. Whenever my father spoke to donors or extended family, he said things like, "We're grooming Lisa for bigger leadership. She has ideas." When my mother introduced us to neighbors, she'd say, "This is Lisa, she's taking over soon." Then turn to me and add, "And Emma keeps things running." Keeps things running as if that were a minor task. The saddest part wasn't that I was pushed behind the scenes. I'd been there my whole life. The saddest part was watching my parents glow with a pride they'd never shown me. Not even when I saved the company from collapse. They looked young again, hopeful again, alive again, and all it took was Lisa walking through the door. I tried not to resent it, truly. But resentment grows silently, the way ivy grows around a house slowly, persistently, until you look up one day and find the windows covered. Lisa wasn't the villain. My parents' narrative was and as they rewrote the past to elevate her, they unknowingly rewrote the future too, placing her on a pedestal meant to carry weight she never learned to hold. But the thing about pedestals is this: they crack easily, especially when the foundation beneath them is someone else's unpaid labor. And soon, that foundation, my foundation, would shift in a way no one saw coming. I didn't notice the shift all at once. It came the way storms crawl across the Georgia coastline, slow, creeping, deceptively gentle until the sky finally breaks open. At first, it looked like a normal family decision. My father stood at the head of the dining table one Sunday afternoon, hand resting on the chair for balance, and announced with a calmness that didn't match the weight of his words, "I think it's time I retire. I've done my part. It's time to let you kids take over. You kids." As if Lisa and I had carried this family equally. As if 9 years of silence from Los Angeles were equal to a decade of 3A team, compliance reports, and emergency Medicaid calls. Mom clapped her hands lightly, thrilled about the idea of a peaceful retirement, and Lisa's eyes shone like she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. I smiled politely, but inside something tightened. I had spent 10 years holding the company together, pushing every inch of my personal life aside just to keep us afloat. And yet, the way Dad spoke that day felt like he was handing over a family farm built by generations, not a business I'd rebuilt from scratch, while he and my mother fought illnesses. I tried to brush it off, chalk it up to them wanting rest after years of struggle. But then the clues began to stack up, one by one. Emails I should have received stopped arriving. Not all of them, just the strategic ones. Meetings with partners, notes from the state, financial projections. For years, everything had been carbon copied to me automatically because I was the one who answered them. Suddenly, messages were routed to my father and Lisa. I discovered this when a hospital partner asked if I'd seen Lisa's proposal about rebranding our dementia care unit. I hadn't, because it had never been sent to me. Next came whispers. A nurse I trusted asked why I hadn't attended the succession planning meeting with the attorney. I stared at her blankly. I had no idea there had been one. A junior administrator told me Lisa had been asking for confidential access to financial files she had no reason to see. And then 2 weeks later, I overheard my parents in the kitchen discussing transferring the properties evenly between the girls. Though the tone made it painfully clear what evenly meant, my mother said, Lisa should get more of the leadership assets. Emma prefers the backstage stuff anyway. Backstage. As if the entire operational backbone of a healthcare company were nothing more than stage crew in a school play. I remember standing in the hallway, hand freezing on the doorframe, listening to them talk about me like I was a dependable appliance, useful, sturdy, easy to replace when needed. That was when the uneasy suspicion took root. They were planning something. Without me, around me, possibly against me. I didn't panic. Panic is for people without preparation. What I felt was something colder, sharper clarity. And that clarity led me back to the people who had given me more genuine guidance than my own parents ever had. My elderly mentors. I called Dr. Alden first. He didn't sound surprised. I was waiting for this. He said, bring every document you have, every license, every contract, every operational agreement. We'll see what foundation you're standing on. I met with him and his friend, a retired healthcare attorney named Margaret Chen, in the back room of a small tea house run by one of Alden's former colleagues. We sat for hours while they combed through every outline of Hart Senior Living, like surgeons preparing for a complicated operation. We reviewed power of attorney, licensing agreements, insurance contracts, vendor deals, state inspections, filed compliance histories, bank terms, and most importantly, intellectual property. It took Margaret half an hour to find the first crack. These buildings mean almost nothing, she said, tapping the paper. Anyone with money can buy a property. What they can't buy is the license to operate elder care in this state. That she jabbed at the state certificate is the real asset. Then she pointed to the next. The care protocols I had written, which were now officially registered as the operational standards of Hart Senior Living. This is intellectual property yours. Then, the software system I had customized over years to track medication, wellness ratings, emergency drills, and staffing compliance. This, she added, is proprietary value. Then, the long-term partnerships with hospitals, hospice agencies, federal programs, and Medicaid caseworkers I had rebuilt from ashes. This is institutional capital, Emma, built by you, not inherited. And then she said, the thing that changed my entire understanding of power. Your parents control the real estate. You control the system. Those words didn't make me angry. They made me steady. For the first time, I saw the situation not as betrayal, but as math. If my parents gave Lisa the properties and LLC, she would own buildings and debt. But without the licenses, the protocols, the brand, the systems, the partnerships, the clinical endorsements without my work, those buildings would be nothing more than expensive shells. That night, Margaret laid out an idea. You need a structure that protects the work you built, something that cannot be gifted away, like a birthday present. She suggested a nonprofit foundation, one whose mission centered on senior care excellence, not family legacy, A foundation that would own the brand, the protocols, the software, the service contracts, and every intangible asset required to operate ethically and legally. A foundation that could partner with any operator, but only those who met the standards I spent years creating. We named it Harbor Light Community Care Foundation. Harbor Light, because that's what the residents always said I felt like. A steady light, a quiet guide, a place to anchor when everything else felt uncertain. Under Margaret and Dr. Alden's guidance and within the full legal authority of my power of attorney, I transferred every non-real estate asset into the foundation. The brand Heart Senior Living, the clinical protocols, the wellness program, the software and data infrastructure, the service agreements with hospitals and hospice groups, the partnerships with insurance networks, the quality of care standards I'd written, all of it. My parents were designated as honorary board members, respected but without ownership. They didn't object. The paperwork was structured transparently and recommended by doctors, lawyers, and the social worker, overseeing their health. They believed it was part of Emma keeping things organized. What they didn't understand, because they never bothered to ask, was that the foundation existed to protect the residents first, the workers second, and the system third. Family didn't appear on that list. Not anymore. By the time the documents were filed, approved, notarized, and logged with the state, the most valuable part of Hart Senior Living no longer belonged to the Hart family. It belonged to the mission, to the standards, to the people who needed stability more than my parents needed pride. And Lisa, she was being groomed to inherit a crown made of cardboard. In the weeks that followed, I worked normally, smiled normally, drove residents to appointments, completed inspections, supported my father, helped my mother, answered Lisa's shallow questions about color palettes that feel more luxurious, all while a quiet certainty settled inside me. They could rewrite the narrative, but they could not rewrite the infrastructure. And the day they tried to hand everything to Lisa, the day they believed they were rewarding her, would be the day they realized what, exactly, they had chosen to give away. Not a kingdom, not a legacy, just the walls, the heartbeat, the structure, the system that was already gone quietly, legally, and irrevocably into Harbor Light, where it finally belonged. In the months leading up to the inheritance dinner, everything in the Hart household began tilting slowly at first. Then, with enough force that even I couldn't pretend not to notice. With the foundation quietly holding every operational asset under legal lock and key, I worked exactly as I always had. Steady, calm, invisible enough that no one suspected what had already shifted beneath their feet. But my parents, in their eagerness to restore the fantasy of a perfect family legacy, pushed Lisa forward with a determination I had never seen before. It began with a photo shoot. One morning, I walked past my father's home office and found him arranging lighting equipment while Lisa posed in front of a printed backdrop with the Hart Senior Living logo. She wore a fitted blazer she'd probably bought just for this purpose, chin lifted as if she had already won awards she didn't know existed. Dad snapped photos enthusiastically, coaching her like a proud talent agent. The next day, the company website featured a new banner, Lisa Hart, Future of Hart Senior Living. My name wasn't anywhere on the page. Then came the fundraising. Mom and Dad began calling relatives distant cousins, old church members, retired neighbors, pitching a small family investment round to support Lisa's plan to open 3 new facilities in the next 5 years. I listened to them rehearse the story in the living room. How Lisa had trained in Los Angeles, how she had big ideas, how she would take the company to the next level. In their version, Lisa was the visionary. In their version, I was the support staff. People believed them, because people always believe the prettier story. I continued my work as if nothing had changed. I attended morning medication meetings, wrote emergency preparedness updates, evaluated staffing ratios, checked logs, walked through facilities with our quality assurance nurses, and followed up with residents' families. But beneath that routine, I was weaving a structure so tight that even the most confident fantasy would snap against it. First, I finalized long-term agreements between Harbor Light Community Care Foundation and major hospitals in our region. 10-year contracts, automatic renewals, quality benchmarks that required the foundation, not Hart Senior Living LLC, to oversee compliance. These agreements didn't block other operators entirely, but they made it very clear only facilities that met Harbor Light standards would receive the brand, the software, the licenses, and the clinical partnerships. Then I adjusted a clause, one that would matter more than any building deed my parents signed. If a facility changed owners and the new owner failed to meet Harbor Light's documented standards, the foundation had the right to revoke brand and license within 60 days. No appeal, no grace period. It wasn't vindictive. It was ethical. Because I had seen too many operators cut corners under the excuse of family succession. Finally, I completed the last piece of the structure, a formal internal review process that required the foundation's board, even the honorary members like my parents, to follow federal quality metrics over personal preference. It made emotion irrelevant. It made favoritism powerless. It meant that the system would survive even if the family fell apart. And the family did fall apart quietly. Beneath the celebration, the invitation arrived on a Thursday evening. A thick cream card with gold lettering, placed neatly on my desk at the facility. A Hart Family Legacy Celebration, it read. My father had invited not just relatives, but the estate attorney, the pastor from our childhood church, a few small-time investors from the fundraising round, and even the banker who had renegotiated our loans years earlier. It was clear they intended to make an announcement official, public, irreversible. I wasn't consulted. I wasn't asked if the date worked for me. I wasn't even told verbally. The invitation wasn't a celebration. It was a sentence. My parents were preparing to anoint Lisa, and they wanted an audience for the coronation. I sat at my desk for a long time after reading it, staring at the edges of the envelope as if it were a living thing. I felt no anger, only confirmation. Everything Dr. Alden had warned me about was unfolding exactly as he predicted. The work I had done wasn't just undervalued, it was being intentionally erased in favor of a fantasy my parents preferred. But I had learned long ago that silence was not surrender. Silence was strategy. So I began preparing not to fight them, but to reveal what was already true. The first thing I assembled was a complete legal summary of everything that had occurred over the past 3 years. The transfer of brand rights to Harbor Light, the integration of protocols and software into the foundation, the licensing agreements, the hospital partnerships, the compliance oversight structure, the quality benchmarks, the irrevocable clauses tied to ownership changes. I put everything in clear, simple language, no legal jargon, no hidden meanings. If Lisa was going to inherit something, she deserved to know what it actually was. Not the storybook empire my parents imagined, but the reality shaped by law, by healthcare compliance, by years of necessity and exhaustion. Then I wrote a separate letter to Lisa, not to shame her, not to plead with her, not even to warn her. I wrote it because, for all her flaws, Lisa wasn't malicious. She was simply the product of a lifetime of praise without responsibility. In some ways, she was as much a victim of our parents' favoritism as I was. She deserved to understand what she was stepping into. She deserved clarity. She deserved the truth no one else would dare tell her. In the letter, I explained what Hart Senior Living had become under the foundation structure. A brand that could only be used under strict ethical conditions. A system that prioritized clinical excellence above family pride. A set of standards that required sacrifice she had never been asked to make. A legal framework she didn't know enough to navigate. Most importantly, I told her this: what you inherit tonight is not power, it is responsibility. And responsibility is what defines leaders, not titles. I sealed the letter carefully and placed it inside a red envelope, symbolic, intentional, impossible to ignore. Then I tucked the legal summary behind it. The night of the inheritance dinner was approaching. My parents were glowing. My sister was radiant. The guests were ready, but beneath all their excitement lay a truth none of them understood yet. I wasn't coming to defend my place in the family. I wasn't coming to argue over ownership. I wasn't coming to stop them. I was coming with the keys, the power of attorney, the envelope, and the quiet certainty that when the moment came, when they formally gave everything to Lisa, they would have no idea what everything actually meant, or what they had already lost. The night of the inheritance dinner unfolded with the kind of polished elegance only my parents could orchestrate: white tablecloths, soft jazz playing from the corner speaker, the smell of roasted herbs and polished wood, the clink of crystal glasses held by people who had no idea they were about to witness the quiet death of a family legacy. The dining room shimmered in warm light, but beneath that glow was something brittle, something strained, like a smile held too long. My father stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his posture straightened with effort, his breathing shallow but determined. He had dressed himself in his best suit, the navy one he reserved for weddings and fundraisers, and he looked almost triumphant. My mother hovered beside him in a champagne-colored dress, her hair freshly styled, her lipstick a shade brighter than usual, and Lisa, front and center, looked like a woman prepared to receive a crown. Her eyes sparkled, her hands were folded delicately on the table, as if she were about to accept an award for a performance she'd never actually given. The room quieted when Dad tapped his glass. "I'd like to thank everyone for being here tonight," he began, voice steady but thin around the edges. "This family has survived a great deal over the past decade. Illness, financial strain, operational challenges, all of which brought us closer and made us stronger." I kept my expression neutral. Many of the people here had no idea what those operational challenges looked like: my sleepless nights, the infections caught early, the inspections passed by 1 point, the families I comforted, the regulations I memorized. But none of that mattered now. This night was not about truth. It was about performance, Dad continued, and much of that strength came from Emma. His eyes flickered toward me, and for a moment, a soft murmur of approval rippled through the room. For 10 years, she carried this family. She carried the business, the responsibilities, the burdens. She carried us. It was the closest thing to gratitude he'd ever spoken publicly. But then he smiled, a small, proud, misplaced smile, and everything shifted. "But now," he announced, "it's time for her to rest." Rest. As if the last decade had been a temporary inconvenience. As if care was something a person simply put down when told to. I felt the weight of that word land across my shoulders like a sentence. Dad gestured toward Lisa, beaming. "Lisa has returned at the perfect moment. She has the vision, the creativity, the leadership energy this company needs for the next chapter. She is the future of Hart Senior Living." My mother stepped forward, clutching Dad's arm. "And our decision is unanimous," she said with pride thick in her voice. "We are transferring both care facilities, the Hart Senior Living LLC, and the remaining accounts." She looked straight at Lisa, "To you." Then she glanced at me with a dismissive, almost pitying smile. "Your sister deserves this. She has a gift. You're talented too, Emma. But your strengths are more hands-on, more like a nurse." A few guests exchanged awkward looks. Some avoided meeting my eyes. A couple of our longtime nurses, who had been invited out of respect, stared at their plates. My father held a cream folder in his hands, the transfer documents, and Lisa reached for them with a shaking, excited smile. That was my cue. I stood, smoothing down my simple navy dress. The room fell silent. Not because I commanded the attention, but because I had learned how to move quietly enough that people looked up when they least expected it. "I have something to add," I said softly. My father frowned, confused. "Emma, this isn't the time." But I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply walked to the head of the table, placed 3 items down in front of me with slow, deliberate calm: the keys, the power of attorney document, and the red envelope. I slid them across the table toward Lisa. "Congratulations, Lisa," I said. And I meant it. My voice was steady, my expression gentle but unreadable. "Truly." Then I looked at my parents, met their startled eyes, and added, I hope this gives you the future you're expecting." Without another word, I stepped back from the table. I didn't storm out. I didn't make a scene. I simply walked away from the crown they had spent so long polishing. Behind me, the room buzzed with whispers as Lisa picked up the envelope. Her manicured nails tore it open eagerly, expecting a sentimental note, maybe a blessing, perhaps a sisterly apology for stepping aside so gracefully. But inside the truth waited, a neatly organized packet. A summary of the legally executed transfers from 3 years earlier, documents confirming that the brand Heart Senior Living, the operational protocols, the care systems, the software, the data infrastructure, the clinical partnerships, and the licensing rights belonged exclusively to Harborlight Community Care Foundation. The lease and licensing agreement requiring any operator, including Lisa, to follow Harborlight standards. And the clause that would define everything. If the new owner changes more than X% of core staff, reduces care quality below the benchmark, sells or refinances the facilities without approval, or fails to meet any compliance condition, Harborlight has the right to revoke the brand, the system, and the license within 60 days, meaning she would inherit buildings, but not the company, not the system, not the heart, not the value. The real Heart Senior Living had already been transferred quietly, legally, permanently to Harborlight. Lisa's breath caught when she reached the final page, effective immediately upon change of control to Lisa Hart. Her eyes widened, her face drained. She looked up at me across the room, panic rising. Disbelief jagged in her voice. "You're joking." Her words sliced through the dinner like a blade. Gasps erupted. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's chair scraped back as he stood. The banker blinked, confused. The attorney leaned forward, squinting at the text. And Lisa clutched the papers like they were burning her skin. But I didn't turn around. I didn't offer explanation. I didn't offer comfort. I simply walked out of the dining room, the murmurs swelling behind me, and let the truth detonate in the room exactly the way it needed to. The quiet child had finally spoken. Not with words, but with structure. The moment Lisa's scream shattered the dining room, the entire table lurched into chaos, chairs scraping, murmurs rising, relatives craning their necks to see what could possibly have been written in that red envelope. I could feel the air shift behind me like a storm front forming, but I didn't turn back. I simply rested my hand on the doorway. Steady, ready, I knew what was coming. I had prepared for this moment with the same precision I once used to prepare medication logs and emergency evacuation plans. And right on cue, a calm voice cut through the confusion. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may." Every head swiveled. Every whisper died. Even my father froze, standing from the far end of the table where he had blended in among the other quiet, older guests was Mr. Franklin Hayes, Harborlight Community Care Foundation's attorney. He was a reserved man in his late 60s, with silver hair combed neatly back, wearing a charcoal suit that didn't draw attention until now. He had been invited as a simple family friend, an old acquaintance of one of my mentors. But he had arrived that evening to serve one purpose: to confirm that my truth was not just emotional, but legal. He held up the documents Lisa had dropped onto the table. "I'm here representing Harborlight Community Care Foundation," he said with impeccable politeness. "I would like to clarify the legal standing of what Missy Emma Hart has presented tonight." My father slammed his fist onto the table. "I didn't authorize any of this. That's my company, my legacy." Franklin didn't flinch. "Sir, these agreements were executed 3 years ago, during a time when both your physicians and the state social worker confirmed that you required assistance managing complex financial and operational decisions." Gasps rippled across the table. He continued, "At that time, your daughter Emma held both medical and financial power of attorney signed by you, notarized in your presence, and filed with the county clerk. All transfers, restructurings, and brand protections were completed under full legal authority and oversight." My mother shook her head violently. "She tricked us. She took advantage." "No, ma'am." Franklin said gently but firmly. Every step was conducted ethically. You were present. You were informed. You signed. And all documents have been reviewed and verified by independent medical and legal professionals. He tapped the packet. These changes were not hidden. They were simply not understood because no one asked to understand them. My father sputtered, searching for air. So she gets everything? Franklin shook his head. No, sir. Harborlight is a nonprofit foundation. No one gets anything. Its assets are not owned by Emma or anyone else. They are held for the benefit of the residents, the staff, and the community. You and your wife were even offered honorary seats on the advisory council, which you accepted. My parents blinked, confused. They remembered the ceremonial invitations, the congratulatory brunch, the nice framed certificates. They had taken it as a compliment. They hadn't understood what they had agreed to. Franklin continued, as honorary council members, you have influence, but you do not hold equity, ownership, or decision-making power. That structure was intentional to protect the integrity of elder care from any future conflicts of interest. My father roared. Conflict of interest. It's our name, and your name remains honored. Franklin replied, but the system Emma rebuilt is protected from being used as a personal ornament, political tool, or as the foundation bylaws phrase it, a family trophy. Oh, his eyes flicked toward Lisa at the last words. Lisa, who was still trembling, gripping the papers so tightly the edges tore. This says, I don't have the license, the brand, the software, the hospital partnerships. What is this? Franklin cleared his throat softly. It is a clear explanation of what the Hart family never fully understood. The real value of Hart Senior Living was never the buildings. The real value was the operational system, the protocols, licenses, data structures, partnerships, and reputation which Emma created and which now legally belonged to Harborlight. My father staggered back into his chair. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" Another relative whispered sharply, so she didn't inherit a company. She inherited debt. Before anyone could ask more, Franklin's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, then raised one brow. This is timely, he murmured. Ms. Hart, may I? I nodded from the doorway. He held the phone up so the room could hear the notification that had just arrived. It seems the regional hospital network has officially approved the 10-year partnership contract with Harborlight Community Care Foundation. Effective immediately. The room erupted again. Dad snapped. That contract should be with Hart Senior Living LLC. No, sir. Franklin's voice remained a steady anchor. Their board required in writing that the partner organization have no direct family shareholders to avoid conflict of interest. Harborlight met that requirement. Hart Senior Living LLC did not. My mother stared at Lisa as if seeing her clearly for the first time. So, what do we actually have? Franklin folded his hands neatly. You have 2 aging properties in need of renovation, a significant mortgage, deferred maintenance citations, and the original LLC, which may continue operating as a private facility if you meet Harborlight standards. Failure to do so, however, will result in immediate license revocation. Lisa looked down at the papers again. Her face paled. It says if I change staff, or cut care costs, or refinance, or try to sell. Her voice cracked. I lose the right to use the Hart name. That is correct. Franklin confirmed. And if I lose the name, what happens? Then, Franklin said gently, you are no longer a recognized care provider. You will operate as an unlicensed private boarding facility if the state allows it. Most likely. The business would collapse. Silence. The longest silence our family had ever shared. Finally, Dad pointed a shaking finger at me. You stole my company. I stepped forward for the first time, calm as still water. No, I said. I protected it. My voice didn't waver. I didn't take anything from you. I didn't take anything from Lisa. I simply refused to let the work I spent 10 years building become a prop for Instagram. I refuse to let you hand residents' safety to someone who has never once shown she understands what care requires. I looked directly at Lisa, not with cruelty, But with clarity, I didn't take the company. Lisa, I took the responsibility. You were welcome to share it, but you were never ready to hold it. Around us, relatives nodded slowly as the truth crystallized. The story my parents had woven about the golden child taking over fell apart under the weight of facts. They finally understood. Lisa hadn't inherited a thriving business. She'd inherited the shell, the debts, the buildings with aging roofs and outdated plumbing, the worn-out furniture and the responsibility no one had ever taught her to carry. The heart of the company, the care system, the compliance infrastructure, the brand reputation had already moved into Harbor Light. Legally, permanently, untouchably, Lisa sank into her chair, hands trembling, staring at the document she thought would crown her. What she held instead was the realization that she had been given nothing but the appearance of power, while the real power had never been hers to take. And for the first time in 10 years, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not spite, not revenge, just peace. The quiet child had finally built something they couldn't break. I didn't sleep the night of the inheritance dinner. Not because I felt guilty, there was nothing to feel guilty about, but because silence has a strange weight after a storm. For the first time in years, my phone didn't buzz with facility emergencies, midnight medication questions, or regulatory reminders. Instead, it stayed eerily still, and in that stillness, I finally understood something. I had stepped out of my role as the family's backbone. Whether they realized it or not, they had pushed me out when they crowned Lisa, and now they had to live with what that meant. The first consequences arrived faster than even I expected. Yen. The bank moves first. 2 days after the dinner, the bank received official notice from Harborlight stating that, due to the transfer of ownership, the foundation would no longer provide clinical oversight or brand certification for Heart Senior Living LLC. That detail alone triggered a reassessment of risk. Within 24 hours, the bank emailed my father, due to the change of control and removal of quality safeguards, we must reevaluate the loan terms and collateralization schedule. Translated into plain English, you lost the safety net. We don't trust you anymore. Interest rates jumped. Payment deadlines tightened. Financial breathing room vanished. My father stormed into my house the next morning, face red, fist pounding my door. You did this. Fix it. I looked him directly in the eyes for the first time in years and answered with the same calm he once praised me for. I didn't do this. Your decisions did. He froze. No shouting. No bargaining. No paternal authority left to wield. Just silence. 2. The staff leave not quietly, but completely. Within a week, the core staff, the nurses who had been with us for 10, 15, even 20 years submitted their notices, not to spite my family, not to make a statement, simply because they already knew what would happen next. One manager said it plainly, Emma, we followed your standards. Not the Heart name. They transferred to the new facility Harborlight opened with the regional hospital. A beautiful, modern building with sunlight streaming through wide windows and a therapy garden in the back. A place built on stability, not ego. Lisa begged them to stay, offered raises she couldn't afford, promised new branding and better marketing. But care work isn't held together by slogans. It's held together by trust, and she had none. 3. The lawsuit that was over before it began. When the bank pressure intensified and they realized the staff exodus wasn't temporary, my parents did what they always did when something didn't go their way. They blamed me. They filed suit against me and Harborlight, claiming I had stolen the business. It lasted 3 hearings. The judge read the POA documents, reviewed the medical reports confirming my parents needed assistance at the time, and acknowledged the state social worker's testimony that everything I did was within my legal duty as trustee and caregiver. Then she delivered the line that closed the case. Healthcare facilities exist to serve the elderly, not to serve family pride. What Ms. Emma Hart structured protected patients, not profits. The court will not reward decisions that undermine care quality. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. My parents walked out of the courtroom as if the ground had been pulled from beneath them. For the first time, they looked small, Not because they were humiliated, though they were, but because the world had finally spoken a truth they'd spent years refusing to hear. They had mistaken ownership for capability, inheritance for leadership, and image for value. Thush. Lisa tries and fails. I will never deny this. Lisa tried. She really did. She showed up early at first, wearing new blazers, hair pulled back, carrying color-coded binders full of ideas. She held staff meetings. She made spreadsheets. She smiled through panic. She filmed cheerful update videos to reassure families. But running a senior care facility is not a performance. It is 3A. Medication emergencies. It is hygiene issues and dementia episodes. It is regulatory requirements thicker than phone books. It is Medicare audits and infection control protocols and end-of-life counseling no influencer class can teach. Under pressure, Lisa reverted to what she knew: cutting costs. She reduced night shift staff. She shortened wellness activities. She tried to replace the wound care nurse with a cheaper contractor. And the results came fast and brutal. One fall incident, one medication error, one family complaint, one anonymous hotline report to the state. Then the inspectors arrived. Within 6 months, Hart Senior Living LLC lost its license. Without it, insurance reimbursements stopped. Medicaid froze payments. Bills piled up. Debt swallowed them whole. 2 months after the license was revoked, the bank foreclosed on both buildings. Everything my parents had tried to hand to Lisa crumbled into dust. Fiend, what they wanted from me and what they received. When the foreclosure notice came, my parents called me not as a daughter, but as a last resort. Emma, please, Mom whispered into the phone. Ask Harborlight to give the brand back, or at least let us keep the name. It's all we have left. I sat in my office at the new Harborlight Community Center, watching volunteers wheel residents into a sunlit room filled with music. I answered simply, we treat every facility equally. The foundation board votes on standards. I'm only one member. She tried again. So you won't help us? I breathed slowly, letting the truth settle not cruelly, but cleanly. I can't save people who refuse to do the work. Then I hung up, not in anger, in clarity. See, consequences without cruelty. I did not let them fall into poverty. I did not let them starve. But I did remove myself from their financial orbit completely. They were forced to sell their house. They moved into a modest apartment near the edge of town, living on retirement checks and state assistance. And for the first time in decades, they lived like ordinary people, not royalty guarding a kingdom built on someone else's labor. Lisa drifted for almost a year, burnt out and humiliated. Eventually, she took the only job she could find with her incomplete skill set: administrative assistant at a nursing facility. A nursing facility in Harborlight's network. She never knew, not because the truth was hidden, but because she never looked high enough in the org chart to see whose signature approved her onboarding. Mine. Shatter. The quietest ending. People assume revenge is loud, but the truth is, the quietest consequences are the ones that last the longest. My family didn't collapse because I punished them. They collapsed because, for the first time, they had to live without the person who silently carried them. And in that collapse, I finally found something they had never once given me. A life that was mine. 3 to 5 years passed faster than I ever expected. Some days I look around my small office at Harborlight Community Care Foundation, the soft morning light spilling across my desk, the sound of volunteers laughing in the hallway, the gentle hum of a piano drifting from a recreation room, and I have to remind myself that this is real, that I am no longer living in crisis mode, no longer carrying an entire family on my back, no longer trying to keep a collapsing legacy from turning into rubble. I'm simply living. And in those years, Harborlight grew not loudly, not with flashy announcements or corporate campaigns, but steadily, like something planted deep in good soil. We opened several more community care centers across Georgia, especially in neighborhoods where the elderly often slip through the cracks, those living on fixed incomes, those without family, those who had spent their lives working quietly until no one remembered their names. We created a training program for young staff members who came from struggling backgrounds, many of them the children of single mothers or from foster care. One of our board members once described them as the children of people no one ever cared for, and we made it our mission to ensure they would never be invisible again. My own life became simple but solid. I lived in a modest apartment near the Savannah River, drove an old sedan whose quirks I knew by heart, and spent my days surrounded by people who believed in the work more than the brand. I didn't need luxury, I needed purpose, and for the first time in my life, I had it without paying for it with my sanity. Sometimes, when my work took me across the state, I'd pass by the old nursing home that once bore the Heart name. It didn't anymore. The sign had been replaced. The color scheme changed. The staff completely new. There was no trace of our family history there. I would look at it the way someone looks at a childhood house that has been sold, a place you once knew by heart, but no longer belongs to you. And instead of feeling loss, I felt distance. Peaceful, necessary distance. Once, while leaving a Medicaid liaison meeting, I saw my parents sitting quietly in the waiting room. My father's posture, once commanding, had softened, his hands clasped tightly together. My mother stared up at the bulletin board with the same frantic intensity she once used to track Lisa's Instagram engagement. They didn't see me, and I didn't approach them. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but because nothing I could say would change what they had already chosen. Instead, I simply wished them well in my mind and walked on. Another time, during a routine visit to one of Harbor Light's newer centers, I saw Lisa. She was pushing a wheelchair for an older woman with snowy white hair, speaking softly, gently, in a way that made the resident laugh like a child. Lisa's uniform hung loosely on her hair tied back, her face bare of makeup. She didn't notice me. Maybe she wouldn't have recognized me even if she had. But for the first time, I saw her doing something meaningful, not for an audience, not for applause, not for Dad's approval or social media clout, but for someone who genuinely needed her, and I let her have that moment. I didn't step forward. I didn't want to disturb the fragile dignity she was building for herself. I simply watched from the far end of the hallway, then turned and walked away. Lighter than I had in years. I'm telling you this now, not to glorify revenge or pretend that winning is the same as healing. That's not the lesson here. What I want you to understand is much quieter and much sharper. Don't give more than you can afford to lose. Because when you consistently overgive, people start to believe your sacrifice is not generosity, it's obligation. The law is not just paperwork. It is the border that protects your sweat, your labor, your nights without sleep, your years of holding everything together before someone else decides to use all of it as decoration for their own story. And finally, this one took me the longest to understand. When people say you only know how to work, sometimes that is your strongest weapon if you know exactly where to sign your name. Today, I no longer carry the Heart name. I changed it years ago, taking my mother's maiden name, the name she had before she married into a family that swallowed her whole. Harbor Light carries that name too, not just as branding, but as reclamation, as a way to rewrite a story that should have been hers. Before I end this, I want to leave you with a question. One I wish someone had asked me long before everything broke. If your whole life you've been treated as the reliable one who doesn't need care, where would you draw the line? At forgiveness or at boundaries? I want to hear your answer, and I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Let's talk in the comments.